This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal. And today we're going to talk about a variety of related issues related to the uprising in the U.S. against police brutality, systemic racism, and state violence. And there have been so many different takes on this. You probably heard a million opinions. Today we're going to try to explore some angles that you probably haven't really heard much about. One of those we wanted to talk about is how the uprising, this massive kind of revolutionary upswell, has been kind of co-opted by foundations, the Democratic Party, large corporations. So we're going to talk about that element of the astroturfing, which kind of always happens, but it's interesting to look at this most recent campaign and see, how with the Biden campaign, the Democratic Party is trying to exploit it. And specifically, we want to talk about big foundations. So the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Open Society Foundations. And then another angle we're going to talk about, which you might have seen in the media in the past few weeks, is really how there's been these kinds of double standards applied to black celebrities and black activists over anti-Semitism. And there's this kind of old canard going back, this kind of like anti-black canard that black people, especially working class black people, are all anti-Semitic, and there's all these stereotypes. And it's really strange at the same time that we're seeing all of this support for an anti-racist uprising, there are also all of these attacks on some black celebrities who, granted, some of them did say some stupid things, but there's really weird double standards there. So joining us to discuss this today is an incredible professor and activist. I'm speaking with Jared Ball. He is a father and a husband, and after that, he is a professor of communication studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, and he is the founder and curator of eIMIXWHATILIKE.org, a multimedia hub of emancipatory journalism and revolutionary beat reporting. You can find that at eIMIXWHATILIKE.org. And he is also the author of The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. So, I began there, Jared, with a really broad brushstroke. I'm wondering maybe if you want to respond to just those issues I raised there, what you think of this moment we're in right now, kind of more broadly, and then we'll get into the specifics later on.
Well, sure. And again, I appreciate you all having me on the program. And I specifically want to say I appreciate you all responding when I, in response to something said to me on Twitter, reached out to a few of you, honestly, in the hopes that whether I was involved or not, that you all would engage on some level this conversation, because not only do I appreciate your work, but there's so much lacking in popular conversation about all of these issues. So I'm very appreciative for this opportunity. And the short of it for me is that, largely speaking, the moment that as I understand it, that we're in, is one where sort of across the board, there is more of a willingness to allow in dominant mainstream discourse certain forms of conversation, certain issues around race, for instance, and certainly police violence, et cetera, are allowed to be discussed because they've been forced to the surface by many people struggling in the street. But what I find to be particularly noticeable in this moment is the sophisticated nature with which, as I would describe it, the propagandized response or limitations put on those discussions is where I find the need to be, engage most in terms of the struggle around those ideas. So in other words, we will sort of, as I understood your intro, we will see documentaries and news reports and even some media and journalism that talks about race and racism and police violence, black people's relationship to the economy to a certain extent, and so on. But that conversation is encouraged, if not entirely successful in this endeavor, to remain within certain limits. And certain limits that ultimately describe the most left, the most left-leaning action possible would be voting for the most dominant mainstream Democratic Party candidate. and anything outside of that boundary going towards the left at least seems to be wildly critiqued, if not fully omitted. So anyway, so in terms of the broad strokes of your intro there, that's kind of the moment that I see us in. So when we're trying to, interpret some of the responses across the board, across communities, I find it necessary to struggle mightily through this initial wave of propagandized narrowing of those conversations.
Yeah, Jared, thanks for putting that conversation call out today. It was specifically related to this whole issue of, the blacks and the Jews are at each other's throats again, which is a completely false framing of what's going on. And it's very difficult to have that conversation on Twitter. It's really upsetting to me to watch this play out again and again. So I thought it'd be much better to have that discussion here. But I guess we should let's get into that in a minute. But I think let's just keep the focus on what's happening in the street. This uprising really began in late May, and it's kind of tapered off, but it's now baked into mainstream culture. It's part of the discussion going forward through the election. That's partly due to Donald Trump putting this 1972 Nixon Southern Strategy Law and Order campaign at the top of his agenda, lashing out at Antifa and everything else. And then you have, Biden, all the pressure on Biden, who is essentially one of the authors of the new Jim Crow, to actually walk back his entire legacy in the Senate. And it's definitely having an effect. I mean, there's pressure, but there are much more radical demands that I've heard in the street that have been on the table for a long time. Community control of police being one of them, and they're at the top of what is officially known as the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm referring here to blacklivesmatter.com, which is the group run by people like Alicia Garza, who endorsed Elizabeth Warren. You don't hear as much of the radical language. You hear, and just going back to last year, Black Lives Matter did like a .com, this group, not the movement, did a census. They called it like the Black Census, and they didn't poll Black people on how they felt about foreign policy or U.S. imperialism, the projection of white supremacy abroad, AFRICOM. They really didn't want to interrogate the legacy of Obama, for example, destroying a sovereign African country in Libya, destabilizing part of Africa. That really speaks to their proximity to the Democratic Party. And I went back and looked at their agenda that they put out for 2020, working with some foundation-based activists. This was before the uprising, before George Floyd was killed. And it was amazing how milquetoast it was and how similar it was to the reformist measures being put forward by House Democrats. There was no mention of defunding the police, even in the sense that 20% should be taken out of the budget and reallocated to social programs. That wasn't even in there. So it really was the streets that have put that on the agenda. The issue that Ben brought up here is foundation backing, the nonprofit industrial complex. And when you see someone like Alicia Garza in public, she's often at places like the Environmental Grant Makers Association, which gathers at a giant stone gated mansion outside New York City for a conference where the sort of respectable progressives meet with foundations like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and ask for more money. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund has just put $48 million on the table for what they call anti-racist initiatives. Same with Open Societies. So I guess my question for you, as someone who's really been on the front lines, is what kind of effect this massive injection of money and a kind of class of activists who are answering to a billionaire donor class has on an anti-racist or revolutionary movement in the streets. What is the role of the nonprofit industrial complex?
Well, first of all, I don't want to misrepresent myself at all. I haven't been what I would consider a frontline activist in a number of years, and part of it,
Or
there are a number of reasons. But
yeah.
go ahead. I just want to be
Or
clear.
maybe front, like
Yeah,
observer.
sure,
You've been in
sure,
academia. You've been in the
sure.
discussions and the debates, and I mean, I'm pretty clear about where you stand
Sure.
there. So
No, I just wanted to be. I just like to, out of respect to the people that I think really do some of that hard, heavy lifting, and that I have done in the past. I wanted to just at least clarify that quickly. But in terms of this sort of somewhat participant and observer and student of what's happening. I see, I've long had a problem with the nonprofit industrial complex role in all of this, and I always go back to the sisters from Incite who put out that classic, "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," about the nonprofit industrial complex and its relationship, particularly to the Black struggle in this country, but who really did a great job of outlining it. And simply put, you mentioned the Nixon era. I mean, this is part and parcel of the Nixonian rebranding of Black power, specifically to be along the lines of mainstream electoral politics and particularly Black capitalism endeavor, where really that kind of push to move the Black liberation struggle out of more radical spaces and formations safely into the nonprofit confines. That's sort of a major turning point that has played a negative role in these activities ever since. And this is in part why I was, even in terms of the issue that encouraged me to reach out and ask for this conversation to take place is because what ends up happening with the nonprofit involvement in general, from my point of view, is that not only does it put legal prescriptions on what people can say and do and organize and how they can approach, but it puts a sort of dependency on foundations for fundraising and professionalizes people's activism, almost to the point where many people seem not incentivized, at least, to truly struggle to eradicate the problems we're facing, but sort of just to keep them on the table because big checks can come as a result. And then and honestly, my favorite story, where I was invited to one of these, once upon a time, to these major gatherings of nonprofits, where I was invited specifically on the conditions I don't speak. I sat in a room and I watched, representatives from nonprofits representing every oppressed variation of every oppressed community in the country. And they gave all these substantive and really, predictable but astounding reports about the horrific conditions everybody was facing. And at the time, Jared Bernstein, who was Biden's chief economic advisor in the Obama administration at the time, he listened, and then smiled and sat up in his nice suit and told everybody, we don't have any programs in the works that are going to address any of this. And then he smiled, got up and left. And everybody sort of shook hands, and that was the end of the meeting. And what became clear to me were that even well-meaning people in the room who had done a lot of great work were ultimately producing that work to secure their next round of funding and a lot of the big paychecks that a lot of people in the room were making. And the careers, the well-funded careers that they have, and then nothing gets done to push an agenda or push anything in more radical direction. So, what it ends up leaving us with, is and this is sort of, again, coming back to the point, my initial reason for reaching out is that what it leaves us with is this sort of vacuum into which a lot of inexperienced activists, scholars, pundits, so on, can move into these spaces and raise conversations and topics in ways that I think don't help advance anything. And then in almost in a condition where they're set up to do this, they then are open to punishment, so to speak, from the political circles and the environment that we're in right now. So anyway, that's one problem that I have just in general that I think is a tremendous inhibitor to advancing any of these struggles.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I referred to it in a conversation with Aaron Mate at Pushback as counterinsurgency. And so you have the co-optation, and that's sort of the soft end of the counterinsurgency. But you mentioned sort of less polished voices or people who don't really have much of a political education. Sorry, my earpiece that Ben makes me wear is coming out left and right. But because he does all the editing. But then, I mean, I want to be clear who you're referring to. I mean, are you talking about people like well, we had heard, I mean, basically these are kind of, in my view, manufactured scandals, but like Deshaun Stevenson, the wide receiver, Ice Cube, who's really been out there for a long time, but he's a devoted follower of Farrakhan and the Nation. These are easy targets for the mainstream to basically paint black militancy as bigoted and ignorant. I mean, is that what you're referring to? Or are you referring to another group of people?
No, I mean, absolutely. And Deshaun, whether it's Deshaun Jackson or whether it's Nick Cannon, and for me, the real problem, one of the real problems at least, is that not only are they addressing issues in histories that have very real and substantive bases to them, but they're addressing them in ways that are either that are presented or packaged in ways that are clearly not going to lead to a kind of advanced conversation or really a substantive conversation of the topics and the materials or the histories that they're talking about. And the reason that Nick Cannon, for instance, can have a class on YouTube is because he's a celebrity who can attract an audience. And a lot of the scholars and activists who would have been working in those spaces and maybe more adept at handling those kinds of conversations and topics are not invited or not given platforms or don't have platforms that attract wide enough audiences. And then the conversation can easily be adjusted and switched from what was the substance or the basis of the conversation between, in this case, Nick Cannon and Professor Griff, or Deshaun Jackson and listening to Farrakhan's latest speech. One would be, what is the substance of the comments being made that could be extracted from the conversation and discussed? Or two, why would members of a community be somewhat drawn to some of the commentary from a Minister Farrakhan or Professor Griff or other scholars that were mentioned in Nick Cannon's class that he publicly apologized for as propaganda, which I found really disturbing. That was actually the most disturbing part for me, was that he was just dismissing whole heart without specific reference or discussion all of the references to in his discussion as propaganda. And someone who has read and studied at least some of those folks, I think that's at minimum problematic. But the real crux for me is there really any opportunity in this country, in this media environment, for there to be a real honest discussion about, one, Black history on its own, and then separately the whatever the real history and engagement between Black and Jewish communities. Where is there room for substantive conversation around that? And in all my years of whatever work I'm doing, I haven't found many spaces for that to take place. So what we're left with is what we get, and then and then they're punished. And as you're saying, it is forbidden and punishable. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the treatment of them where they're publicly disciplined by very powerful people reinforces what they were saying in the first place. It reinforces the anti-Semitic perception that Jews control the media and politics. But we have to acknowledge a few things. And I want to get into Louis Farrakhan and why he has influence as well, because you're never allowed to have a real conversation about that either. Although we did publish a piece at the Gray Zone by our friend Hamza Raza about the reality of Farrakhan's influence in sectors where no politician can reach. Most politicians can't reach. So I want to talk about that, but what I think needs to be acknowledged, first of all, is power relations. You can never talk about power relations when you talk about Black-Jewish relations. And that's the most clear way of understanding what's going on. Black people in America are basically powerless. Jewish people, we're white for the most part. We are affluent for the most part. We are highly educated. I mean, we are powerful. And I don't know why Jews have this problem acknowledging their privilege. They always, I noticed there was a hashtag on Twitter the other day, Jewish privilege. And a bunch of Jewish Twitter users, including, left and liberals, got together and started talking about what happened to their grandparents and their great grandparents in Europe. And I'm like, yeah, that's terrible. My family fled to some extent anti-Semitism in Russia and Ukraine, before the Bolshevik Revolution. And so that's real. That's not what's happening right now. Okay. We have BAs, we have grad degrees, and then it's really much worse at the ground level. Okay. I lived in Jersey City for 2 years, north of MLK Boulevard, in a mostly black area. I live in Ward 8 in DC, but it's a particular problem in Jersey City where when it's time to collect the rent, you will see minivans filled with Orthodox Jews come out to get the rent, and people are just steaming with anger. And the Orthodox Jewish community in New York, the Satmars, they are completely insular. They don't even regard me really as truly Jewish, but they don't see Gentiles as exactly human, and they are exploiting people in a horrendous way and bringing all the money back into their own community. So when I would tell people in my neighborhood in Jersey City that I was Jewish, they didn't even believe me, because their idea of what a Jew is the guy who has payas, who's wearing a 19th century uniform, who comes to collect the rent every month, and they hate them. And they get kicked out and their buildings never get repaired. And so there has been anti-Semitic violence and intimidation in that part of Jersey City where people have nothing. They have no savings. They're living hand to mouth. And Barry Weiss, from a well-to-do family in Pittsburgh, who's been given every opportunity and every pro-Israel fellowship, just a creature germinated in the neocon hothouse, went down to Jersey City to exploit that tension and paint the black community there as just a bunch of Jew haters. I think one member of the city council made some complaint about Orthodox Jews being exploitative. So that's really why it rings true. And it also maybe rings true for people like Nick Cannon, because he worked his whole career for Viacom. Who owns Viacom? Sumner Redstone, who also owns BET, right? And Sumner Redstone is a wealthy, I think a billionaire Jewish guy who's very pro-Israel. And so here, Nick Cannon just makes these ignorant comments, stereotyping all Jews, and then he gets the exact treatment that seems to reinforce what he said. So let's talk about the real power relations, or Deshaun Jackson, the NFL's run like a freaking plantation. Daniel Snyder, he had been defending this racist name of the Washington football team. He's about to be exposed in what's supposed to be the biggest scandal in NFL history. He's a Jewish American. He's a Jewish guy who's a Trump supporter who Deshaun Jackson used to work for, technically. Deshaun Jackson has so much less power than him or Bob Kraft, who's bringing all his players over to Israel. Why are we not allowed to talk about these power relations? Why is it that, let me just say it. I think that the public disciplining of these often rags to riches black public figures by powerful Jewish people, or, millionaire CNN fake news host Jake Tapper going after Tamika Mallory for cozying up with Farrakhan, actually does more harm to race relations and is actually more racist than the ignorant comments that any of these characters might have made. That's my opinion.
No, I agree. And I think, so first of all, I think that there's no, and I think you touched on this at the beginning, your comments there.
My rant.
No. that there is no genuine interest, really among any group, I would argue, but in this case between Jews and black folks, there's no genuine interest among Jews or really any group for some massive coming together and overcoming of races or racial tensions or whatever antagonisms in history. There's no collective institutional will really in any group for this. So there's this overlay of disingenuousness, certainly in the commercial media landscape of all the virtue signaling and the Fred Sanfords, I'm coming to die and meet you, Elizabeth. When people say something, it's like all these emotional responses and outbursts, which are really, I think, primarily meant to initially blunt any potentially radical ideas or critical thinking that might emerge from any conversation. That's really the first. Because underneath even what Farrakhan says, underneath this is, and this is what is frustrating for me at least, is a reality that needs to be addressed or discussed, but it's presented and packaged in a way that I think is one meant to reaffirm and reconfirm his base. But then is echoed in mainstream outlets, media outlets, as a way to reaffirm and reconfirm their base, which is to keep everybody separate, everybody hostile, everybody confused, everybody angry, and blaming one another for the crumbs that we're all left to fight over. So that's one part of it. So as I've seen in your work and some of your colleagues over the years, when you talk about just in general, for instance, the program, the prescribed response to use claims of anti-Semitism to promote and protect Israeli policy, for instance. This is similar to what I see happening here, that in some cases, since the policies are so similar, the policy objectives are so similar, that it's used as a way to make sure that, in this case, Black people and Black communities don't raise certain questions that are critical of the relationship they have to this economy. Then to the other point that you raised that I think is very important is that by and large, Black and Jewish communities don't, just like many other communities, don't really have a significant interaction. And unfortunately, from my point, it rises to that distance rises to the level of even radical politics and journalism and alternative media. But certainly at the grassroots level, there is no substantive exchange. So when Black people come across Jews, it is often in these nexuses of unequal power relations that you talk about, and often in the spaces where, from my understanding of the history, Jews have been relegated and forcibly left. Now, it may have turned out for Jews relatively well economically, but there's a historical reason that goes beyond quote unquote dismissed conspiracy theory or something more nefarious. There's a history why Jews end up so heavily located in certain segments of the economy.
Definitely. Going back to the banning of usury in Europe and
absolutely.
So on. By the church.
Absolutely.
So definitely, it's hard for people to see that history when they're below that group, so far below that group and being exploited by them.
And when they're only interacting at the points that you're talking about, when rent is due or when a TV or music contract is up or in some other unequal and often antagonistic and hostile relationship. And then what really is still an existing problem is that what foments so much of the anger and honestly, for a number of reasons, and maybe we can come back to this. I don't in this regard, I don't really, and you may disagree, I don't consider when Black communities lash out in these instances, even when they say some things that are harmful, I don't consider that to be quote unquote anti-Semitism. I consider it to be something else, and maybe I don't know exactly where to put it.
Can I interject a
sure,
point there
sure.
that actually supplements what you're saying, which is that it isn't just about Jews per se. If we consider what led to the LA riots or the LA uprising, one of the incidents was the shooting of a Black girl by a Korean merchant.
That's right. That's right.
And that's what inspired Ice Cube's song, which was just deeply anti-Asian, Black Korea. But It was a response to the community anger over that and their treatment by the Korean merchant class, who was an immigrant group that wasn't exactly, doing so great. But and that the Koreans at that point, at that generation, were having the same experience the Jewish Americans had a generation before, as a kind of merchant class profiting off of urban proletariat or urban poor that was not upwardly mobile. So so I think you're right. It's really about who their most immediate exploiter is. There's a lot of anti-Arab racism as well in Jersey City, for example, where you don't have Jewish shop owners anymore. You have Egyptian shop owners.
Mm-hmm. And then also beyond that, of course, obviously, that there is no institutional, national, organized effort to exterminate or become hostile towards Jews or anybody else within Black America, even if Black people somehow had the capability to do that. There's no effort there, so it's all these sort of almost immediate. And then underneath that, of course, also are another layer of mythologies that for me are mythologies that go back to biblical histories that I think are not really histories, but are mythologies and really even recast African philosophies if we keep going back far enough. But in that mythology is this idea that there is supposed to be this sort of religious and ideological unity between Black people and Jews, given what is the biblical recounting of Jewish history in Egypt and the mythologies, what I think are overblown, unfortunately, mythologies of collective institutional sort of national Jewish support for the civil rights struggle. There's this frustration after that where Black people are saying, we keep hearing about all of these mythological points of unity, but they don't play out in the reality of our spaces. And then to the point that you started this show with, this conversation, when you start to look at all the foundation support and the money flowing in and from where it does go back and start to support some of these more simple conspiracy theories. And the kind of existing antagonism that can be easily fomented and inflamed whenever is necessary. But ultimately, this goes back to this broader problem that we find ourselves in terms of the struggle against capital, against white supremacy, against whatever you want to call it. And this is one of the ways it plays out. But when I see it. So for instance, I don't have a particular, need to feel sorry for even Black celebrities or Black athletes in certain instances, but I have found myself profoundly feeling sorry for Nick Cannon and Deshaun Jackson and several others who find themselves, I think, on the one hand, struggling to make a legitimate search for bits of Black and African history that are intentionally suppressed and that most Jews and others have no idea about and are not discussed in any other communities. So there's this struggle to find that information, which is already hard enough to find, and then to find it maybe distilled or packaged in a way that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and then to be punished for that, I think, unduly. And then by the way, when Julian Edelman tells Deshaun Jackson, I'll go to I'll go to the Black Museum if you go to the Jewish Museum, and then you can come to Auschwitz and all this other stuff. To me, it's just so disingenuous. Like, on the one hand,
wait, let's just stop for our
sure. Go ahead.
Julian Edelman is like the tailback, slot back for the Patriots, and him and Tom Brady have been really tight. They've had a combination for years. And him and Brady are also Bob Kraft, the owners, Golden Boys, and they've been on. Bob Kraft sponsors all these trips for players to go to Israel as part of pro-Israel propaganda in the NFL. But Edelman, he comes in, and basically he's the player who's assigned to discipline Deshaun Jackson because he's one of the few prominent Jewish NFL players. And we should play like a little bit of the clip that Jared's referring to.
There's no room for anti-Semitism in this world. So to that end, Deshaun, let's do a deal. How about we go to D.C. and I take you to the Holocaust Museum, and then you take me to the Museum of African American History and Culture. Afterwards, we grab some burgers and we have those uncomfortable conversations.
It's crazy because he's wearing this black hat and it says JE11 because that was his number, but it looks like it says JEW, like Jew, on his hat, which really tripped me out. And he's got a Star of David on, and he's like talking about how he never really was Jewish before until he was an adult, because that's now his brand. And he invites Deshaun Jackson to go to the Holocaust Museum. In exchange, he'll go to the Museum of African American History, as if the two are the same.
Right. That's right. One is if the two are the same, and if the two even are meant to convey the same message. Right, I mean, there's room to debate that as well. And then as if I don't know. I mean, as if this is enough in either way, as if Edelman has had some sort of concern for any of these issues in advance of any of this, or as if, you know, or I don't know. But I think actually what I think is best is how you described it. This is a disciplinary act to bring Deshaun back into the fold, and really to go back to I forgot which executive it was when the whole issue of between the NBA and China kicked off last year, where it was just expressed, basically just shut up and dribble. Which is really ultimately what these black athletes are supposed to do. And in Nick Cannon's case, he's supposed to shut up and dribble a microphone, so to speak, and not push the envelope in any direction really. Which was also kind of funny because if you watch the entire conversation that he has with Professor Griff, I mean, they have a long conversation. One that starts with Professor Griff telling his story of how his criticisms that they discuss later in the show led to his ouster initially from Public Enemy back in the late 80s, early 90s. And then Nick Cannon, and then they end up having a conversation about more or less Nick Cannon saying, I'm trying to be you, even in this, mainstream commercial space that I, inhabit, with almost the idea that he could pull it off. I mean, it was almost naive in the sense that he could pull off having any form of unsanctioned conversation. Because by the way, if Nick Cannon let's just say Nick Cannon wanted to talk about Black-Jewish relationships and he invited you on to have this conversation, maybe the conversation would have it would have not been possible to label it in the conventional sense, although I know you've experienced this differently, as anti-Semitic. The same kinds of arguments or attacks would have been waged at you and his conversation for probably different reasons, but all for the same purpose of limiting any potentially upsetting conversations, particularly hosted by Black people who are supposed to be playing a very different role and behaving.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he would have been fired anyway, but it would have actually at least provoked a kind of healthy conversation about Palestine and issues like that I would have brought into the mix. And I think the substance of the conversation would have transcended the venue, which was a corporate venue that's completely controlled, which is the embodiment of the manufacturing of consent, the Edward Herman propaganda model, where the government doesn't actually have to come in and enforce speech laws because corporations will do it just as easily. But here you have like an incident which is actually being used to justify consent manufacturing. We can't let these conversations happen freely. We gave him a show and he went and said this crazy stuff. So Ben, I don't know if you want to jump in here.
Yeah. I think what's really wild about this, specifically with the Nick Cannon case, is, I mean, speaking of how these attacks in some ways actually kind of reinforce some of these kind of reactionary views, even if we understand kind of where they come from. What's so incredible is that Nick Cannon was pressured to agree to go on a trip to Israel. So here's Algeminer, which is a right-wing pro-Israel propaganda website. Nick Cannon demands apology from Viacom CBS, announces trip to Israel after media giant axes him amid anti-Semitism furor. So, I mean, you're talking about how many of these responses, in fact, fuel the problem and make it even worse under the guise of fighting racism. So now he has to go on a tour, a propaganda tour, which I'm sure the media is going to scrutinize every minute of Israel, which, of course, there's not even any discussion of the fact that Israel is a state founded on racist violence, on ethnic cleansing, where the prime minister is in his, fourth or fifth term, where he basically just stole the election, who is a far-right racist, who is Donald Trump's best friend. I mean, it's so surreal.
No, I mean, it's the question is almost, are you being invited to Israel so you can get sort of a hyper experience of racism practiced elsewhere, as opposed to what is supposed to be, an end to racism. And I want to be clear, like, even as I made the point about Max, you being on the show, I don't think that Griff and Cannon should be prohibited from having that conversation. And I don't think that Black people looking to find answers to their questions should inhibit themselves from having certain conversations with whoever's in the community. whether we agree with it or not, by the way. So I'm not advocating that they not be able to have that discussion. What I'm most disappointed about is the exclusion of what I would consider more appropriately radical, and this is just my bias, politics and conversation to in terms of those histories. Because again, I mean, there is value to discussion. For instance, where are Black people supposed to go to have discussions about, African origins and the questions over the Semitic languages, that involve African people, the role of Kemet or ancient Egypt in all of these histories. In other words, these very real and important histories and topics don't have room. Room is never made for them to be discussed almost anywhere. So again, in a way, it kind of reminds me of a few years ago. I wrote briefly, was in a letter writing exchange with David Gilbert, the Jewish political prisoner who's still locked up for supporting Black liberation struggles in this country. And I was just sort of asking him about Black-Jewish relations and what he thought, this and that and the third. And I've always liked his response. Part of which he was rejecting my comparison to him as my generation's John Brown. He has a I think an interesting answer for that, but I was saying, why do you think, as I was referring to him as our generation's John Brown, it's been harder for you to engage some of these conversations or to be brought into some of these conversations despite being a political prisoner? And his response in short was the attack, the counterintelligence program attack on Black liberation has sort of imprisoned the scientific analysis, if I can paraphrase what he wrote, and left this vacuum for a lot of other forms of conversation. So this, again, has been done intentionally so that when people have these kinds of conversations, it's almost a prediction that they will leave themselves set up for a hostile attack and a rebranding and a reframing of conversations that I think should be had as anti-Semitic or hateful or something that should be held up and really literally put, held akin to Hitler or modern day Hitlerian language. Which again, for me, is really a disturbing problem.
And this is actually, I think, kind of explains why, for a lot of Black folks in the U.S., there is this kind of binary that's presented by corporate media outlets, by institutions, by large foundations, between the kind of neoliberal Democratic Party respectability politics and between the kind of politics of Farrakhan. And I think it's not a coincidence. I mean, if you look at, Max mentioned Jake Tapper's attacks, constant attacks on Black politicians who have any, or Black public figures who have any association whatsoever with Farrakhan, despite the fact that, regardless of what you think about his ideas, this is a guy who has significant influence in the Black community. We also have to ask why that is. Could it be because Farrakhan actually has a long history of ties to the U.S. state, to police agencies, even the FBI, and the violent extirpation, the extermination of the progressive revolutionary leftist Black nationalist forces, the murder of Fred Hampton, the intentional sabotage and destruction of the Black Panther Party, the brutal destruction of the Black Liberation Army, and just really, so anytime there is a progressive, revolutionary, especially communist Black political movement, anti-imperialist Black political movement in the case of the Black Panthers, it is ferociously destroyed by the state, and what's left is the liberal democratic voices, the Barack Obamas who are neoliberals who can use some of the language of respectability politics on one side, or the figures like Farrakhan on the other side.
I just was going to make a similar point, or almost the same point, but in reference to your critique, Jared, of Spike Lee's treatment of Malcolm X. There's this scene in the film that always captivated me because it frustrated me so much, where Malcolm encounters, I think it was in Algeria, Muhammad Ali, and says, "Come, we're going to go meet with Ben Bella, who was the post-colonial revolutionary leader, leftist leader of Algeria." And Muhammad Ali says, "No, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that, I can't deal with you." And there was so much in that scene about where Malcolm was going that wasn't focused on or really discussed. They do show his call at the UN for global reparations, but it's basically glossed over. In a sense, the memory of Malcolm X at his most revolutionary phase, at his phase that was most dangerous to U.S. empire and global white supremacy, was glossed over by Spike Lee in favor of his more criminal phase early on as Detroit Red, and then his more kind of conservative separatist phase. And it seems almost like that whole history is not observed today, even after the figures were physically killed under COINTELPRO and by, killed or sabotaged under COINTELPRO.
Well, absolutely. And honestly, as you were saying that, I'm trying to remember, are you perhaps remembering the Will Smith Muhammad Ali film and that scene? Because I don't think that scene happened in Spike Lee.
Okay, wait a minute.
And the reason I say
got that completely wrong. So they didn't even show that scene in Spike Lee.
And that's my point.
That's even worse.
That's my point. So in all the years that I've been critical of the public conversation around Malcolm X, or the public rebranding of Malcolm X, that, one of the points I've often made is that you get more of the real Malcolm X in that brief scene in the Ali film than you get in the entire multiple hour film by Spike Lee.
I transposed it into the...
Yeah, I mean, but it's, and in fact, oh man, there's so much to say about that because I've been dealing with that for so long. Going back even to when that film was first coming out, there was an overt discussion in the mainstream press where Warner Brothers was saying that they wanted to turn Malcolm X into a popular brand, just like The Simpsons and Batman.
Oh my God!
So there was a clear and very conscious effort, in fact. Of all the things Spike has done, that's the one film I wish he would have never made, because I do take the position that I would rather there be nothing about Malcolm than that be the dominant pop cultural thing about Malcolm, because it's so distorting. So that's one point. But to your larger point about it, that's exactly right. And if we look even again at and I've debating scholars and people about this for so long now, but even if you look at the more recent Netflix documentary that came out, I mean, it's the same kind of thing. You get 6 hours of a documentary that doesn't talk almost at all about the politics of Malcolm that would have made him a threat. It's just all about, a CSI mystery to try to catch the one Nation of Islam shooter. It's absurd in its politics, and not even revelatory in its claims historically. But this is, of course, part of the same kind of problem I was alluding to earlier, where, to borrow the phrase applied elsewhere, Malcolm X is too big to fail or too big to omit. So he has to be rebranded. He has to be constantly rebranded, and books have to constantly be rewritten about him, as was the case with Dr. King and to a lesser extent, Stokely Carmichael, with some new scholarship, all meant to represent these people in ways that minus their actual politics, specifically so that the history can be discussed without people who are uprising now picking up on those politics and trying to apply them today. Obviously, that is my broader argument. So, absolutely, this has to be, I think, part of the conversation when we're looking at how popular Black politics are taking place in general, or how these histories and issues are being discussed specifically. Going again back to Gilbert's point, once you wipe out all of these movements and lock the people up and exile the people. I mean, today we're taping this. It's Assata Shakur's birthday. She's still taboo. And yet would have something much more substantive to contribute, were she in the mix politically in this country. And yet, so we're left with an intentional, a vacuum intentionally created, into which people like Farrakhan can step. Now, there's another part to this that I think that I think needs to be added. On the one hand, I don't think Farrakhan has the importance in Black politics day to day that is often suggested. On the other hand, I think that he does have the impact that he has, in part because the Nation of Islam still will deal with segments of the Black community and will go to spaces in the Black community that many, many even Black people don't want to go. They will provide protection and support at times for rallies or organizations that don't find that support elsewhere. So they are in spaces that a lot of Black pundits won't go to, a lot of Black academics and activists won't go to in Black communities. And this is where some of that ground, grassroots connection is made. They're, of course, often in the prisons, reaching out to people and offering some sort of psychic or spiritual outlet that they're not getting elsewhere. So there is a level of work that the Nation of Islam does to develop this relationship that other segments of the community don't do. So on another hand, it's almost seems, so similarly, even where I have my own criticisms, it seems almost unfair in some ways, or almost an impossible situation, given I'm not in these spaces often enough. And often enough, I'm in spaces where I'm in collegial solidarity with members of the Nation of Islam. So that is why Farrakhan is able to have the space that he has. At least one of the reasons why he's able to have the space that he has, and he attracts a certain attention, which is in some cases why I think to a certain extent, whether it's him or those who speak on his behalf, there's to me. I don't mean even to be this dismissive, but there is a performative element to this that is meant to keep a certain level of relevance and attention when I don't know that anything else that he would do would get that attention. For instance, none of the other things that the Nation of Islam might do that is positive would garner nearly the kind of media attention that he gets when he makes something more of an incendiary comment.
Yeah, or when he. I can't remember if it was Peter Jennings or who it was, but there was this famous interview with one of these kind of wax museum sculptures who's animated into a newsman, Tom Brokaw, I don't know who they were, interviews him and then they try to embarrass him about the Great Mother Wheel and the kind of creation story. And then he takes him on and really starts punching back. And you start to see some equality that you've never seen before on a mainstream media platform. That's inspiring to a lot of people who've been beaten down their whole lives. I think that it's performative, and it's based on, this image, but the image is sort of well earned. And there's this also part of the image is that Elijah Muhammad would always say to his followers that we will never be touched and turn the other cheek the way that the civil rights movement followers are, where people are constantly getting brutalized by cops, getting shot. And the civil rights leaders, including, Martin Luther King early on was saying, we have to just use our soul force and just sit there and take it. He was saying, we're not going to take it. We're going to organize. They have the Fruit of Islam, who are, guys who are trained in martial arts. I remember in DC, one of the worst or most dangerous areas for a period of time was Clifton Terrace, which is on a hill right above U Street. It was kind of like public housing, and there was no security there for the residents. I remember it was a drug spot throughout much of my life growing up in DC, and the Fruit of Islam came in where no one else would come in and provided security there, and people respected that. So there is an image that I think is earned. And it speaks to a lot of people. And that's another thing that you can't actually say in public, I guess, because then it means you're an anti-Semite.
Well, but I mean, it's also that if you have, but this is the thing, like you have a Black community that for all intents and purposes has been abused and abandoned. And then when it develops its own form of response to a certain extent, and yes, and Ben, I heard in your question, I mean, there is some support, there is some state sponsored space, for certain, whether it's the nation or other elements to operate. But it's still something that emerges more or less organically out of the conditions Black people are forced to suffer. And then, the anger from, as I would interpret it, at least from Black people in various elements of the community or segments of the community is more or less, how dare anyone be critical of people, even if we are critical of him or them. It's like, again, there isn't, it's on the one hand, again, I'm saying that the Nation of Islam has, I think, a misunderstood and overemphasized relationship to Black people in general. But at the same time, when people see Jews or other groups, condemning them for whatever reason, right or wrong, the response is sort of, well, how dare any of you have anything to say about our leadership when none of you have anything to do or say substantively to get us out of these conditions? And I think this is part of the conundrum that we're in. And then, as I was saying earlier, all of these mythologies continue to be thrown on top of it. Whether I start with my own, all the biblical ones and all of the who are the all of these questions that Nick and Professor Griff got into throughout the context of that discussion, I think are fascinating. What is the historical relationship between Africa and Judaism and Christianity? How do you get a largely group of European descended Jews being described as the only Jews? Now, Jewish history has at least some answer for this, whether it's the Great Dispersals or all of that, or those forms. But these conversations never get anywhere. In part, starting with, again, as I started earlier, the groups are not substantively together. There is no substantive exchange between these two groups, and there's too many vacuums left in these spaces, I think in both communities, so to speak, where the people who enter them to have the conversations are often more conservative or reactionary than I would want them to be, certainly. And it almost feels like the radicals within all of these groups find a way to be separate. Again, one of my ongoing criticisms of in terms of media is I don't often do much critique of mainstream media. My criticisms are of what is often described as the alternative, or in some cases the white left media spaces. And in those spaces, I find most frustration, and where there's not enough engagement between Black radicals and white radicals to fill up some of this void that gets picked up in other spaces that brought us to this conversation today, if any of that made sense, So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very real issue. And what's so interesting when I'm thinking about all of these, how all of these issues relate, is I think of how similar this kind of political contradiction and social contradiction is to the situation in Israel-Palestine, where we see, again, weaponization of anti-Semitism to totally write off a popular national liberation struggle against a racist settler colonialist regime. And of course, the history between Palestinians and Black Americans is very different. I'm not trying to say that they have similar, or identical, or even very similar histories, but there are some similarities. And I think what's really interesting is looking at how throughout the Cold War and throughout the same time as COINTELPRO in the peak, 60s, 70s, when the U.S. state domestically is waging a brutal, murderous war, an actual war on its own domestic population to destroy the Black liberation movement, to destroy the revolutionary left as a whole, but specifically the Black liberation movement. You can look at the documents, many of which are now released, looking at how they murdered Fred Hampton because they were afraid that he could be a Black Messiah figure in their language. And it's the same counterinsurgency strategy. That's the term Max brought up earlier, counterinsurgency, which goes throughout all of this. The same strategy adopted by the U.S. British empires in Israel, Palestine, and against the indigenous Palestinian resistance, and then by Israel itself. So people now know that throughout the Cold War, the U.S., the Brits, and the Israelis supported the Islamist forces inside the Palestinian resistance in order to undermine and divide the leftist secular resistance of the Palestine Liberation Front, the PLO, and waged a brutal war against the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was a revolutionary, communist, Marxist-Leninist, anti-imperialist force, which has a lot of similarities, you could say, with the Black Panther Party. And it's not a coincidence that these are the parties that were the ones repressed the most, that saw the most vicious forms of repression. And when they were basically destroyed, I mean, the PFLP still exists, but it's the remnants of the PFLP. They were forced into exile. And the same with the Panthers. There are still, there are forces that are modeled after and inspired by them, but the state just did everything it can to uproot and destroy these forces. So what's left? The resistance forces that are left tend to be the more right-wing and nationalist forces. In the case of the U.S., you have the more right-wing of black nationalism as opposed to the left wing. And in Palestine, it's the right wing of the resistance movement. It's Hamas. It's the more Islamist forces. So I also think that that's not even just the case of the black community in the U.S. and Palestine. That's true throughout the world. And that's how we get, Iran is a good example of that, where it's, this is an anti-imperialist government that is on an international stage. It's fighting white supremacy. It's fighting imperialism in a way, but it's also, this is in some ways a pretty right-wing government, at least socially. And if you look at forces like Hezbollah, in order to understand why these are the forces that, especially in the Middle East, are leading the resistance today, we have to understand that history of a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, of a genocidal counterinsurgency campaign. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because it's so interesting to look at how today these same criticisms of anti-Semitism, reactionary views on gender, etc., these are all, I think, instrumentalized by liberal imperialists to try to discredit all forms of anti-systemic and anti-imperialist resistance around the world and in the U.S. as well.
I'm loving that you phrase it that way, because I'm looking at my notes and my comparisons are way softer. So I love that you took it there. And I think, initially, I can't think of anything that you said that I would disagree with, only would want to learn more about so I could elaborate at some point on some level. But for instance, so one, I start there. I fully agree. On a much simpler level, I was looking at my notes here, and I'm saying, so a couple of weeks ago, Jay Electronica finally comes out with a long-awaited album, and he's got a line on there referencing a Farrakhan statement about the synagogue of Satan. And it comes in this really, it's a dope track. The beat is fantastic. The verse is fantastic. Even the rhyme scheme where you hear that phrase is fantastic. And I was listening to it with one of my oldest daughter in the car, and it sparked this whole conversation that I really struggled around with her to get to all the nuances of it all. But my real point was that it sparked a conversation between Peter Rosenberg and Ebro on Hot 97 in New York, the most commercial radio hip hop station ever, with a long track record of just abusive, hostile black promotional campaigns and playing the worst forms of hip hop. It's just so. But in this conversation, it was this whole thing of again the Rosenberg disciplinary thing. In a context where, he's not railing against all the uses of the N-word in popular rap music that he helps promote on a regular basis and his show helps promote it. But it comes a condemnation of Jay Electronica and his backwardness. So that was one. And I took it as again this I think you were putting it, this neoliberal narrowing of the conversation on a when else is Hot 97 going to have this conversation about black people and Jews with any substance? And here they come with when it's convenient to attack Jay Electronica and the immaturity and irresponsibility of black rappers, as if that's who should be the focal point of any political struggle or commentary. Anyway, then the other ones were Ben and Max, the work that you and your colleagues were doing, where, for instance, where Aaron Mate is talking a lot about both of you, all of you have talked a lot about the Russiagate nonsense. And I was thinking, I had made a note that I'm thinking that there's a comparison here where not that Farrakhan or Professor Griff's or Nick Cannon's commentary was fictitious or a conspiracy of sorts, but it's used in a if I can work with me here, maybe, the way you all argue that the Democratic or the liberals in the media were using Russiagate in an attempt to attack Trump ended up in as I believe at least Aaron and maybe you both were arguing, would embolden Trump and actually end up helping Trump.
Exactly.
This is something that I see happening here, where the condemnation, as you pointed out earlier, of Nick Cannon for having this conversation as being anti-Semitic and then fired by a company owned or run by a Jew, reignites or reaffirms the hostilities. And similar to Max, what I thought was hilarious in your recent thing you did on Pushback, the critique of the open letter on freedom of speech. which to me again, so to me it feels like a similar kind of thing happening here, where it's again, people who have made careers off of limiting conversation and offering the most narrow of analyses, or making room for the most narrow of analyses, are now going to come back and tell us that Nick and whoever and Deshaun should be disciplined or fired, or because they're the ones fomenting hate and inhibiting free speech. Anyway, so those are the comparisons I was, messing around with, and then Ben took us to a whole other level there, which I appreciate, and I agree with.
I want to actually address the Peter Rosenberg disciplining of Jay Electronica, because there's a background there, and I've been waiting for that album too. I mean, this guy, he drops the EP and leaves everybody waiting. I thought that album was pretty good. I mean, it maybe fell a little short of my expectations, but it was pretty good. And he has a clear command, and you can tell that there is a deliberation behind Jay Electronica's lyrics, that he means what he says. And he put a lot of thought into it, and his use of the term. I mean, I think the album opens with a Farrakhan sermon. Am I wrong? Yeah. So he's not really hiding his support for Farrakhan. And his use of the term synagogues of Satan actually was also used by another rapper, Hellraiser, who is from the Maccabees, loosely connected to Wu-Tang, or emanated out of the world of Wu-Tang, where he got drawn more into the Black Hebrew Israelites, who do have a tendency to use bigoted language, although it's not very present in most of his lyrics. Synagogues of Satan was a 2002 sermon, I think, by 2003 by Louis Farrakhan, which is taken to be anti-Semitic. I definitely think it has deep anti-Semitic undertones, but it is specifically about the neoconservatives who are taking the United States to war with Iraq in order to advance Israel's geopolitical interests. And, I think, you're definitely opening the floodgates for some anti-Semitism there when you say that. Sure. But read the content of the speech. He's not referring to Jews as a whole, and he is talking about how neoconservatism is a perversion of Judaism. But I can't defend it. I mean, the title is The Synagogues of Satan.
Well, that was one of the points I made in what I said about that.
Contextualize.
Yeah, but my point was that was if I had a chance to, because I tweeted to Jay and to Rosenberg and said, let me host this conversation, because they had at one point said that they would talk to each other, and I said, well, let me host it. And then I realized, I'm not famous enough to get their attention, but I would have said to Electronica the same thing I would have said to Cannon or anybody else. If it is in fact true that you don't intend to offend anyone, then you have to find another way of phrasing it. If for instance, Farrakhan had phrased his critique of the Iraq re-invasion of Iraq in the way that you just phrased it, I don't think he would have opened himself up for that criticism. And I also don't think he would have reaffirmed himself with his base either. And I also don't think he would have, and this is something I've wanted to. I have it as a joke, but I often joke that I think he and Abraham Foxman have a relationship that off the record relationship where each.
Well, there actually is kind of a relationship.
So that's what I actually wanted to ask you.
Are you talking about Peter Rosenberg?
Huh?
Yeah,
No, I'm talking about Abraham Foxman and Farrakhan.
And Farrakhan.
So, in other words,
they're the best of enemies.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But go ahead. But anyway, but this idea that because I know that they fundraise and swell their numbers using each other's commentary. So anyway, go ahead.
I mean, I'm sure we have some listeners who were tuning in for our. who are completely lost right now. But, this is something that's very particular to U.S. culture and to the discussion about Black-Jewish relations is where Peter Rosenberg himself comes from. It's a context very similar to me. Maybe even, I know Peter Rosenberg's father very well. I've known him for years. And he grew up in the D.C. area. He went to college at the University of Maryland.
That's right.
He was around the radio station WMUC.
That's right.
Which is where a lot of talent has been trained.
And can I just shout out to the Soul Controllers, who I know as a DJ crew come out of that station. So shout out to them, just in case they happen to hear this.
There's a lot of great programming, and you can't really hear it because corporate radio controls and Christian right radio controls the DC airwaves. But he came out of there. So he was a college kid, then he goes to New York and gets on one of the big corporate stations, which is just pumping out garbage day after day, which is another part of counterinsurgency against Black America. Just pure trash, just reinforcing the worst tendencies that sell. So, that's one problem there. But the other issue is that Peter Rosenberg, I would never be someone to blame anyone for the perceived sins of their father. But Peter Rosenberg's father was the research director and I said perceived, was the research director for AIPAC, the main arm of the Israel lobby for years. His name is MJ Rosenberg. And he became kind of a dissident. And he came out against AIPAC and said, they're bad. And he was very hysterical in the way he would express himself. But I was friendly with him because I'm a journalist who's reporting on this. And he was kind of, helping me, providing some context for what goes on inside the AIPAC conference rooms. But then, things started to really develop. I think he thought that by coming out against AIPAC, he would help pave the way for a two-state solution and an Israeli state and liberal Zionism. But things started to develop and accelerate a little too fast for MJ. Me and Ali Abunimah, who is the founder of Electronic Intifada, we started doing these talks around the country about BDS and the one-state solution. And we were attracting a lot of attention. My book, Goliath, started this major debate. And MJ started calling me and Ali anti-Semites. Every other tweet was about how we're anti-Semitic Jew haters. And he reverted to his old self. And that really seems to have carried over to Peter, who doesn't see that he is engaging in a really unfair power dynamic and kind of nitpicking in a way, just so he can advance his own agenda. He has yet to say that as a Jew, we have nothing to do and want nothing to do with the Zionist project. I don't think the Zionist project represents all Jews, but he needs to take that stand and clean up his own house before he starts lecturing Black people about their own bad opinions. And that's something that too few American Jews are willing to do, which is to divorce themselves from and condemn the racist apartheid project of Zionism that's being carried out in our names, that offers us a second country that few other people even have on the backs of an indigenous people. So that's what I think about Peter Rosenberg and that whole corporate project he's running up there. I don't know why he doesn't get called out more. But
I confess my ignorance. A lot of us don't pay enough attention to the backgrounds of some of the people that we've been listening to for years. This is certainly the first time I've heard this, and I've been, a critic of Hot 97 and in some ways Rosenberg and specifically for years. So I didn't. So one reason would be
sorry to cut in, but it's kind of like Jerry Heller steps out from behind the curtain. And is out front. Jerry Heller is the kind of guy who created the whole concept of this exploitative gangster rap, who was a Jewish businessman, and Ice Cube denounced him, and now he's kind of out. Peter Rosenberg's just like, I'm the DJ, I hold the mic, and I'm in charge, and let's keep pumping out this trash, and then I'll be the gatekeeper on opinions as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And, what I was going to say just briefly is that one of the reasons why I think that none of us is known is in part because of, again, the broader construct of our media and political apparatus, which in part denies any, you mentioned Zionism. That's one catchword we're not supposed to reference or discuss at all. And even the mention of it puts people, has a target put on people's back. And as I was watching again in preparation for this conversation, the conversation with Nick Cannon and Professor Griff, I was trying to look for, almost as a joke, like what statement really got people upset. And at one point they do mention Zionism. Nick Cannon just mentions it in passing, not even to focus on it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he just says it in passing. He just says something like, we're not, something like there's this and then there's Zionism and then there's this and this and this and this. And I started laughing. I said, that might have been it right there. I mean, just that alone, given who he is, in the relationship he has to commercial media and being in everybody's home on a regular basis, et cetera, and so forth. And by the way, I don't know if we mentioned this. I thought it was funny that Fox did not fire him. He only Viacom. Fox has retained him. So apparently he'll still have which I thought itself was interesting. Why would Fox not have a problem with him? Maybe there's something in there, or maybe they're just going to wait to get a more headline firing later. But anyway, that was his mention of that word. I thought might have done it more than almost anything else that he said, because other than broaching certain topics that I know are considered taboo, I don't think that Cannon went as far in advocating any of the ideas that they're upsetting to many whites or Jews that he's being blamed for. But at the same time, I think what was really the problem was that they were engaging in a conversation that is just not sanctioned. It's one of the many conversations that's not sanctioned. And whether it's a claim of anti-Semitism or a claim of radicalism or whatever other ism they could have found, one of them would have been dragged out to condemn the talk, unless it stayed within that very liberal, Democratic Party is as left as you can go kind of conversation.
Yeah, like, Ta-Nehisi Coates going on the road with former Israeli prison guard and Atlantic magazine editor Jeffrey Goldberg to talk about racial reconciliation. That was totally cool.
Well, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, an Israeli-led tour of Israel and Palestine is what better way to get an education on hate and racism.
People are blinded by like the current situation, but really in 20 years, 30 years, people are going to see that as if we think today someone going on a trip to apartheid South Africa to try to erase their racism or something. I mean, like it's so crazy to me that going on a trip to Israel is prescribed as a supposed solution to racism. It is absolutely dystopian.
Well, that's sort of where I was starting earlier with my whole grand concern right now is not that at one point in my life, I felt like there were certain topics that were made literally invisible. And now it's a more sophisticated form of propaganda where everything is being discussed. It's just being held in very narrow confines. I find it tremendously concerning. And as you were saying that, Ben, I was thinking, at least once upon a time, at least even the freedom riders were not tourists.
Yeah, and this is a kind of a different point, but it's something I was thinking of, and it relates to this. And we're already at an hour and 15 minutes, so we can start winding down here. But what's interesting is that I think this double standard has been pointed out a lot. But when Trump was elected, there was this endless debate within, especially the U.S. left, about, I hate this term, but so many people use the term the white working class, which is an awful term. I hate that term because the working class is multinational, multiracial, trying to divide out, like you can say working class people who are white, but the white working class is not a block. I hate that term. But anyway, there was this endless debate, and there were all of these, specifically these kinds of like social democratic, DSA aligned, Bernie Sanders style leftists who would make a lot of excuses for some of the reactionary, backward views of some of these white people in the Midwest and in the South who have some pretty racist views. And I spent most of my life in the South or the Midwest in the U.S. My family's from Ohio. Spent a lot of time in Kentucky. I lived in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Maryland, Southern Maryland. So, I've spent most of my life, understanding that environment. And I don't think we should excuse that environment. We have to understand it, but we shouldn't excuse it. And I think that some people on the left and the white leftists some of them were being way too soft on it. But I think what's interesting is that some of those same people who are willing to, they're not, to be fair to them, they're not excusing it, but they're, I think, being a little too soft on it. Some of those same people would not in any way be soft and apologetic about some of the reactionary views among some working class and poor Black people. And the reality,
Yeah, if they actually heard them, if they actually heard what people really said.
of course, and the reality is that around the world, this is not a problem isolated to just poor and working class white people in the U.S. and Black people in the U.S. Around the world, working class and poor people, especially oppressed nationalities, if you don't have access to a lot of education, that is often, those are environments where people will sometimes be attracted to simplistic answers like blaming a particular ethnic group or whatever. And it's very easy for white liberals who have a degree from Oberlin or whatever to lecture people, on poor Black communities on maybe some anti-Semitic views or whatever that they harbor. Or this is also related to the discussion about women's rights, right? Because there's often this kind of class dynamic with people who love to lecture poor and working class people about their views on women and not using the right language. So I just think that, that's a huge topic, a huge can of worms. But I also think there's definitely a strong class element to this that, because the reality is that Black Americans have had their wealth stripped away from them to the degree that they've been allowed to have wealth. I mean, after hundreds of years of slavery and then Jim Crow, and then to the degree that there was a Black middle class emerging in the US, I mean, that wealth has been totally, almost entirely just stolen through the financial crash, through just banks defrauding Black loan people who Black families that had loans, and we now know that numerous banks would refer to Black loan holders as mud people. That was actually the language used in some of these documents that were released from U.S. banks. So just the blatantly racist policies. So the reality is that because of this history of racism and racial capitalism, the reality is that the Black community is overwhelmingly poorer than the white community. And there's not that people aren't willing to kind of understand that reality, and they'll make excuses for poor whites in the same way that they won't make an excuse for poor Black people to have some views that might be problematic.
Well, to the extent that I'm following you, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this myself, and I think I admitted I think in one of the DMs setting this up, I have my own background is Black father, Jewish mother, and I have older siblings who are in the Nation of Islam. So I have and I joke myself, I'm the radical Drake or whatever. It used to be a joke I would tell on radio, but. But I should say the better looking radical Drake. No, I'm just playing. But I admit that I and myself, one of I admit that one of the areas around which I'm hesitant in public discussions of this is being not only publicly critical of the nation, but publicly critical of the nation in any way. On quote unquote white platforms, I admit that. So I acknowledge that on some level I would be participating in what I understand you to be raising as an issue. And I have a bias there as well.
I think you're being too hard on yourself.
Well, I mean, maybe, but on some level, I want there to be an honest dialogue. So I want to at least make that point clear. Like I do have more of a criticism of the nation that I wouldn't go into here or now that I don't think is appropriate. And maybe I'm wrong for that, but it's at least true.
Yeah. And this isn't the environment. Yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, I mean, I think on some level you're right. And at a certain point, any community looking to become revolutionary has to evolve a certain political education and analysis. And whatever historical abuses are very real and inhibiting that have to be dealt with and addressed and can't be just, to the extent that I understand what you're saying, excused. But beyond that, and I think this is sort of my point in wanting to reach out about having this conversation. That even as I'm complicit to a certain extent in limiting the conversation, or maybe even upholding some mythologies. These mythologies need to be at least addressed. And as I say about everything that I'm asked about, I wouldn't want anybody to agree with or turn away from any of the ideas I express because of the inability of Jared to argue them in that moment. So in other words, I wouldn't want people to turn away from or to join the Nation of Islam just because of something they've heard me say here. And I wouldn't want people to turn away or to investigate some of the ideas that we've discussed just because of what they assess as my ability to advocate them in this program. In other words, I want just what I want to advocate at this moment is that people get more involved in critically looking at all of these related issues in the context in which these conversations are taking place, and to at least be alerted by me to a certain extent that there's a lot not being said and not allowed to be said in those conversations. And there's, as I think we've been pointing out, a lot of undue blame being put on individuals and communities for these kinds of problems and inequalities that continue to exist. That is clearly unfair. So, but to the extent I understood your point, Ben, I think you raise a legitimate point. It's legit.
Well, what's related to that point is that, what's interesting is that, I know that we have so many haters, and I know they're going to scrutinize every little detail to try to find something, say they're excusing anti-Semitism, they're excusing all that. But I think that to make another analogy that kind of explains better what I'm trying to get at, this contradiction. It's an international political contradiction that in many class societies around the world, right, is that I think you can also look at the issue of women's rights. And, I've been living in Nicaragua and spent a lot of time in Latin America in the past several years. And even on the revolutionary left, when it comes to the issues that would be just considered unquestionable, not only among revolutionary leftists and socialists in the US, but among liberals, issues like abortion access, birth control access, other things like that, especially related to, sex and birth control and things like that, and children. On the Latin American left, it's a much more complex issue. And, there are a lot of very revolutionary people who have more complex views that would be considered reactionary or even misogynist by most of the US, the global North left. And I'm not trying to make excuses for the fact that, some of these leftist governments, excluding Cuba, which Cuba, by the way, is the only country in Latin America where abortion is free and paid for by the state, and any woman can have access to it. So that is a good counterexample. Of course, Cuba followed a Marxist-Leninist model as opposed to other more hybrid models that were kind of more nationalist influenced, like in the case of Nicaragua, which is a very Christian country where the Sandinista movement has a lot of Christian influences. There are views on women's reproductive rights and things that would be considered kind of sexist here that are mainstream among the revolutionary left. And so anyway, the point I'm getting at with that is that I'm not necessarily making excuses.
And it's used by like upper class leftists in the US to attack the Sandinista movement with no understanding of what context they're operating in.
Well, and it's used by the upper class in Latin America. It's used by educated liberals and even in some cases conservatives, as we see right now in Mexico, where there are conservatives trying to use the issues of women's rights to attack the progressive president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And in the case here in Nicaragua, there are rich elite liberals neoliberals, but liberals in their outlook, who try to attack the Sandinista front by saying that it's misogynist, which is ridiculous because the Sandinista front actually has a lot of policies mandating 50% women's representation, and Nicaragua actually is in the top 5 for women's representation in the government in the entire world. But when it comes to issues like abortion is totally illegal here, they're without exception, and that's an issue that I'm not a fan of, but it's a contradiction we have to unpack. And what's interesting is that the same kind of liberals attacking the Sandinistas or the Chavistas for that matter, because it's not legal, abortion is not legal in Venezuela either. the same liberals attacking the Chavistas and the Sandinistas overwhelmingly, almost always, are educated, elite, rich liberals. And it really reminds me of the disciplining of members of the Nation of Islam and the disciplining of working class black nationalists who didn't go to Ivy League universities and don't have that same class background. And there's that opens so many points, but I think I just wanted to make that analogy because I think it's pretty similar to the issue of like the role. And again, not to excuse some issues that some people might have with feminism and women, women's rights, but I just think that like these are very complex discussions, and often liberals who come from petty bourgeois or bourgeois backgrounds and are highly educated won't allow for that kind of more complex, nuanced discussion.
I think that's a great point. And, as you were talking, I was just thinking about all the times, even Max, to your point about who, activists being on the ground that was raised early, one of the many problems is that people who are critical of the Nation of Islam, as I alluded to earlier, have never been in the communities, even black people have never been in the communities that the Nation of Islam works in, have never talked to rank and file members of the Nation of Islam and sat and looked into their eye as they break down for you what the nation has done in terms of saving them from the lives that they were left to in the communities that they were abandoned in. So to then look at these people and to see that pain and that struggle in their eye and the love they have for the salvation that they found in this movement, and then to then want to raise, well, but then I don't necessarily agree with this particular kind. It seems, to your point, Ben, it has to be dealt with. It's a contradiction that has to be struggled around. But there is a tendency, and I think a class tendency even within Black America to condemn folks in the nation or that politics, maybe even privately, if not publicly, and not actually want to grapple with why those politics exist or why why an organization such as that would have the influence that it does have. And again, a large part of it because either they've been abandoned by all segments of society. And I think to the point that you raised just there, Ben, is that the fundamental reality is something that I started with earlier as well in the conversation. The people who are having these conversations don't, in my estimation, really, as I would describe it, want to win. They're not interested in an actual victory. They're not interested in actual revolutionary change. So whatever pathway they can find to walk us back, whether it's hating a specific comment or hating a specific organization or picking on a specific adherent to a concept of a set of ideas, it's done so that any effort, anyway, the idea that, again, because the reverse is not done, even in the moment of all the statues and flags and criticism of all, of all this white supremacist iconography in the country, we're still being asked to excuse and to balance and to consider the times that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were in, and to consider the shortcomings. That yes, they owned human beings and trafficked and raped human beings, but they had such intelligence and high, lofty ideals. But at the same time, that same level of consideration is not made for people with whom they don't agree and don't like and don't want to, in some cases, see get free at all. So.
And absolutely. And, I think going back to an earlier point that you made, and this is kind of the last issue I want to throw your way, because I actually got to go, but it's something that I've been kind of forced to look at in a more direct way than I'd wanted to in the past. And it was, I always kind of considered it background noise on Twitter that was kind of annoying, but, where I think what it is this kind of hyper liberal identity politics, which is highly manipulative, and it's embodied in figures like who are just getting so much attention and obviously getting a lot of money now, like Robin DiAngelo. These figures who've kind of moved into this vacuum that's been created where people don't know what to think or what to do, and so they're turning to the first available. This is what a lot of white progressives are turning to, affluent white progressives. And there are also, Black self-styled educators who are playing that role as well. And I think it comes from people just black and white people, you were talking about black and Jewish people not having much contact. Black and white people don't
Correct.
tend to have much intentional contact, except maybe in the workplace, on campus, maybe. Chris Rock had this joke that like black people have lots of white friends, but every white person only has like the one black friend.
That's right.
So, these characters like Robin DiAngelo, who has this book called White Fragility, which I saw the other day at a bookstore in the window in a gentrifying neighborhood on H Street in DC, right next to Madeleine Albright's book. I thought that place was pretty appropriate to encapsulate the hyper-liberal mentality that pervades those areas of like luxury lofts built on top of like houses that burned down in the 68 uprising.
Right.
Wait, and that's Madeleine Albright's book on fighting fascism, right?
No, it's a new one that's like a memoir. She has like more memoirs.
Did she really have a book called
Hersier.
Fighting Fascism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
The war criminal who defended the death of over 500,000 Iraqi children from sanctions has a book on fighting fascism.
So anyway, Robin DiAngelo, I mean, I was watching this other speech by, I watched a talk she gave in Seattle, which is one of the whiter urban areas in the country, and another one by one of these educators. Her name is Rebecca Cargile or something, in Bend, Oregon, at a TED Talk, which is like a 92% white city. And yeah, they're deliberately engaging white audiences and telling them how to be an anti-racist. Anti-racist is a very loaded term. I'm not exactly sure what it means, but what it seems to boil down to, and it's triggered a lot of white people and a lot of right-wingers too, is that they have to acknowledge that, first of all, there is a white community, there is a white collective, and that white collective is toxic, because whiteness is toxic, and they have to go through various workshops, which these teachers have been giving to corporations like Amazon and the Department of Education in New York City or wherever, where basically white people not only acknowledge their privilege, but they acknowledge that they are all bound together in their whiteness, which is toxic, and they have to somehow sort of cast it off and extirpate it by bowing down in an almost masochistic fashion to these teachers who never discuss something like capitalism and the role that plays, and also kind of reaffirm the separateness. I mean, this has gone totally mainstream. Jimmy Fallon had Robin DiAngelo on. It was just like fawning.
It was the number one selling book on Amazon.
I mean, I used to encounter this on Twitter a lot, and I was just like, I can't even deal with any of it. It's like, because once I made a critical comment about standing up, it was very like passing comment, like in just a Twitter comment. I wasn't even really going all out, and I just saw standing up for racial justice, this like group of all white people calling on white people to stay away from Black Lives Matter's first organizing conference in Cleveland and organize in their own communities. And I was like, that seems like segregated organizing. Maybe I was naive, maybe I'm completely wrong, but my view of it is a sort of reinforcing separateness, getting people to adopt sort of a masochistic mentality. There's a manipulation that alienates people. And also there's a profit motive, an ulterior profit motive, and a fear of openly even critiquing capitalism. So it kind of just, it feels like another part of the counterinsurgency. Maybe you totally disagree with me, but what do you think of this trend?
No, I don't disagree, I think, at all. And I think that, and in fact, I think that your use of the word or phrase counterinsurgency is perfectly appropriate. Again, to the point I was trying to get to earlier, the moment I think we're in, maybe more than at any other time, certainly in my life, it feels like, is that we can have all the discussions we want as long as they're being held in certain very narrowly constructed ranges of debate. And one of the things that is coming out with a lot of the literature lately about basically teaching white people about their whiteness is is I think encouraged because it almost never has a material component behind it. There's never any
Exactly.
platform or radical redistributive. I remember years ago I was at a Dead Prez show, and I thought it was one of the funniest moments of my life. We're at this show and had a huge white audience, and they start doing this point. They're on the stage and they start saying, white people, if you're in solidarity with us, put your hands up. And of course, everybody puts their hands up and everybody's rocking. And then they say something like, now keep your hands up if you're willing to something material, like give us money or redistribute wealth or sign up for a program. It was just something like that. And then you could just feel the vibe change. All the hands started going down. And it was like, and it just seemed like that indicative of these kinds of moments where as soon as there's something that goes beyond, I think in general, white people don't mind, particularly white people that don't want real change, don't mind being told that they're racist and they should go home and sort of speak with each other about their racism or their whiteness. Nobody really minds that. I think the issue becomes an issue when there's some sort of program or platform behind it. So for instance, if white folks were encouraging those books to go to where they're invited, at least Black, organized spaces to follow Black leadership, I think it would have a very different welcoming, and a very different financial level of support or publication support. Just as one example, if it had something in there that said, for every, I don't know, something redistributive in terms of public policy or something more radical that would be required of people behind just a vague, I get it, we're racist, we're white, we whatever. It just won't have the kind of room to breathe in this environment. So I think that. Again, I'm appreciative of this conversation because for whatever shortcomings people will find in it, and I'm sure there are plenty, I think there's an attempt here that I don't see happening in many spaces at all, and including a lot of the alternative media spaces that I frequent on a regular basis. So, and that's really the importance for me that I wanted just to have, in some way, help people be reminded of the fact that there are contexts here and histories and in particular radical ideas and formations that are almost never considered when these issues come up.
It was so crazy watching this TED talk because the speaker said, because you're talking about Black leadership, which obviously has to be accountable to a community and have a real constituency, and then a program that will benefit the mass of Black Americans. But this speaker said, don't ask us what to do. Get on Google. We shouldn't have to do the emotional labor for you white people. So just go to a corporate search engine and
listen. The reality is there's a cottage industry that has evolved over several decades now. Look, I had a former colleague and I told him I was going to make fun of him, so I'm not doing this behind his back. that at the time Obama got elected, he told me he was a colleague of mine at Morgan State and he quit. And he said, I'm going to write my magnum opus, which is going to teach white people about Black people, and I'm going to go get paid. He failed in part because I told him those positions were filled by more famous and popular academics and Black punditry. But now he's an exaggerated example of this, what I'm talking about, and it was almost a comically exaggerated example of the fantasy here. But this is part of what I think is at play, that there are people looking to get paid to tell whites and others whatever they think that they need to hear or would want to hear. And this is how you get the cushy academic appointments and the institutes, the research grants, and all kinds of things that come with it, and the paychecks. Because it really, as it was I thought a perfect indication of this when she was running for president and the Black Lives Matter activists confronted Hillary Clinton at one point of her campaign. And I've never ever felt any more affinity or agreement with her than in this moment, because they said what they said to her, and her response was, "Well, what's your platform?" And she said, she said something like, "I'm never going to be able to convince white people not to be racist. So, like, what do you want beyond me just to tell white people to stop being racist?" And these particular activists didn't have much to say, and that's sort of the point. Like. She's like, fine, look, we'll talk all day about white people being racist. They don't care. But what is your actual platform? And if you have something that's more redistributive or clear in its goals, it would be condemned for sure. But what I thought she was saying very clearly is, look, white people will listen all day to you. if the extent of the conversation is white people need to learn about their whiteness, because there's no ask in that. There's no demand in that. There's nothing that has to materially be given up or power or relinquished.
Or they'll be totally alienated when they may have benefited from a program that gave them some material benefit as well, like universal healthcare, single payer. Right. I mean, that would change so many people's lives right here in Washington, D.C. And I mean, that's just not a program that's on the table in this presidential election.
And it's not something that's discussed in the narrowly confined discussions of race and intra-racial relationships or interracial relationships that started this conversation. And that's sort of one of my criticisms, that again, after the explanation of the history and the inequality and the injustice, what are Black leaders, in this case, and Black pundits advocating be done? And in response, the same thing. If people are upset at what Nick Cannon or Deshaun Jackson or Farrakhan or anyone else said, what are they doing actively to address the material inequality and the abuse these communities are suffering? Because if that abuse goes away, for instance, to your point, perhaps if everybody had universal health care, people would be maybe a little less angry and hostile or concerned about who or what group is to be blamed for preventing that access.
Yeah, and I think part of this whole liberal framing of anti-racism, which of course, everyone in the world is going to say, of course, I support anti-racism and anti-racist. But part of that framing is keeping the discussion, and not just the discussion, keeping the political action centered around the white racists and trying to stop them from being racist, and not actually helping to liberate people who are oppressed. And that's why they use the term anti-racism, but you never hear the term Black liberation. When was the last time I've never heard a pundit on the news, on the corporate media, or even in many alternative media outlets call for Black liberation? That term that was one of the key demands of the Black Power movement, and it's just, especially with the kind of NGO foundation left we were talking about, you'll never hear them use those terms.
It's also not on one of the approved terms by the NBA for the jerseys that are coming out.
Yeah, there's 29 slogans that have been approved on the back of NBA jerseys that players can wear. Another counterinsurgency tactic, I would say, to allow players to express themselves, but within narrow corporate confines. So is
Vote Biden 2020 one of the approved slogans?
I think that comes embroidered mandatory. I don't think that's even an option. Yeah. It just comes on there. But I agree with Kawhi Leonard, by the way, who said, look, we need more than a slogan. We need a program. He said, I'm not worried about putting what slogan on my jersey when he was asked. He said, I want a program. And I agree with him. And he's the NBA champ, so why not listen to him?
Yeah. And LeBron said a similar thing. I'm not going to wear a slogan when it's clear what I represent in my own actions off the court. But group economics is one slogan you can wear. That was one. Yeah. Si se puede, yes we can, which is kind of like the Obama slogan. Well. And ally, I guess the white players can wear ally.
Oh God.
And the whole concept of allyship. I mean, I gotta go, but that really speaks to it's kind of a liberal conceptualization where you are not thinking. First of all, you're not able to sort of think for yourself, but you're not a comrade in a group struggle. You're not working together for a program, and you're not a friend either. It's sort of like you're just robotically following orders of someone who you have to see as the appointed representative of all Black people, even if they may not have
because MSNBC and the Ford Foundation appointed them, not the Black community.
There's a book that I'm interested in, Comrade. I forget who wrote it, but it's sort of a counterposing a different way of relating than the kind of ally concept. But I always questioned that term when it kind of came up in I remember it got popular in like 2013, 2014, and now it's just like people say.
Well, same. the revolutionaries have always said, comrade is the appropriate term. And of course, Amilcar Cabral has the quote that I'll bastardize here, where he basically said, a comrade is better than a friend and a family member because it's someone who has chosen to work on an agreed upon political project. And I know I didn't do the quote justice, but Cabral, was right. And I agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Ben, are we ready to wrap here? Because I should bounce probably.
Yeah. Jared, was there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I'm good. I appreciate this. I think I've said all that I need to.
Me too. It was definitely therapeutic for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up here. Actually, we're at almost 2 hours, but I think it was a really awesome discussion. And I'm gonna plug that everyone go check out. We were speaking with Jared Ball, and you can go to eIMIXWHATILIKE.org, and you can find his website there. You can also find his book, The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. That was an awesome conversation, Jared. Thanks so much for joining us. And where can people? I mentioned your website, but do you want to plug anything else?
Just at eIMIXWHATILIKE for all your relevant social media. And again, I thank you both for this conversation. And like I always say, like Fred Hampton used to say, to you, I say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jared, for coming through. And I want to do something slightly unorthodox for our show just because I was moved to do so. But I feel like we could close with some music for this show. A song written by a Jewish communist, I think in 1934, named Abel Meeropol. And the song is Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Great example of collaboration and for a real cause. And I don't know if there is a am I right or am I wrong? Is there still no federal anti-lynching law on the books?
Still correct. Not that I'm aware of. No.
All right.
Well, we'll see you all next time, and we're out. Well, actually, that's not going to happen. This is Ben speaking here. I edited this full video, and we had this nice, beautiful ending with the Billie Holiday song, and I uploaded it to YouTube, and it was censored. They not only blocked it because it has copyrighted material, they said that actually because of the inclusion of that copyrighted video, this would not be available in numerous countries. This is why we can't have nice things. Large, massive corporations control our access to information at all times. So we can't really be that creative here. Here's the normal outro. We'll see you next time. Sorry.